Hi, and good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar. Today we'll be discussing violence indicate potential verbal and nonverbal violence. My name's David Martin, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'll give you background on LENSEC. LENSEC's been a trusted security and surveillance partner with experience in the U.S. and around the world. LENSEC has a background working with many types of industries and help customers develop enterprise solutions for complex physical security projects. We've developed a powerful security platform called Perspective Video Management Software. And this enterprise VMS streams and captures IP security video, and it incorporates video analytics, access control, and more into the software. And I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment, but first I'll go over a few logistics for the webinar. We'll be taking questions during the webinar, and you can enter those on your GoToWebinar panel, usually as you'll find at the bottom right. We'll collect those during the presentation and answer questions at the end of the event. Also, we'll present poll questions during the event, and we encourage your participation in answering the questions when they are presented. Basically, you'll see a pop-up, and you just select your best answer. If you're interested in the completion certificate for today's webinar, indicate your wishes at the end of the event on the survey that we will present to you. And then we'll follow up in a few days after the webinar with certificates, answers to the questions, and a copy of today's presentation. Also, we record these webinars, post them on our website at lensec.com, and we'll provide you with a link to that webinar video archive as well. We sponsor these monthly, and we cover a variety of safety and physical security information. So check back what's coming up next in the Step into Security webinar series. Today's physical security expert is Gary Sigrist. And Gary is a nationally known speaker, consultant, author, and expert on emergency preparedness. During his 30-year career, he has been an educator, an administrator, and a police officer. Gary's background gives him a unique point of view on safety and preparedness in education environments. Gary is president and CEO of Safeguard Risk Solutions, and his company helps its clients identify vulnerabilities, plan accordingly, train thoroughly, and respond effectively. Gary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everyone from, I'm just outside of Columbus, Ohio, where it's a blustery day and rather chilly, and we have some snow going on. So I don't know where all of you are from, but I hope it's a little bit warmer. I'd also like to thank LENSEC today for providing this webinar at no cost. As a security consultant, I know how difficult it is for organizations to sometimes find the time and the resources in helping keep their employees, their customers, their clients safe. So with that, let's get into today's webinar. What we're going to be taking a look at is how do we know if there may be violence on the horizon? Are there indicators that we can look for that can help protect us from violence? Because if we know the warning signs, we can either disengage or we can de-escalate the situation. So what people always ask me is, you know, in the event of a violent situation, do people just snap? And the answer is no. If we look at most targeted acts of violence in the workplace, at schools, in churches, etc., these are often well-planned events. Some of you are looking at the screen now and are saying, why is there a picture of an angry person and a snowblower? I live in a neighborhood where most of the residents are elderly, and when we do get a significant amount of snow, I get my snowblower out and I do everyone's driveway. If I were to commit an act of violence and they were to interview my neighbors, most of my neighbors only know me from clearing their driveway, and they would say, boy, Gary's the nicest guy, he must have just snapped. But we know from studying these past events this is not the case. Now, sometimes people do engage in violent behaviors because they, as we say, fly off the handle. But if you're looking at somebody who has planned something for a while, you're not going to see them just snap. So what we look at is we kind of look at a continuum of violence. And I really like this. I like this graphic. Graphic shows us that it starts out as usually something mild, you know, intimidation, what we call mugging. When we get into escalation, now someone may actually stand close to us. They'll get into our space, and then we start to get into force, hands-on, pushing, touching, poking, things that cause us to have some concerns about the person's behavior. So there's a book that I really like. It's called The Gift of Fear, and it's by Gavin de Becker. And we've also included a link which you'll be able to use when you when you get a copy of this PowerPoint. That he's in an interview with Oprah Winfrey. And what's really unique and good about this book is it helps us understand when somebody is about to engage in some violent behaviors, whether it's a person on campus possibly wanting to attack a female, whether it's a coworker. We see these tactics of manipulation, you know, forced teaming. In the video clip that you'll see on the Oprah Winfrey interview, the attacker kind of joins with the female and says, come on, we need to take care of your cat. We're in this together. If you look at people like Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer, he was extremely charming. They'll offer too many details. You know, someone might say, look, I want you to come with me. I promise you I won't hurt you. Well, why would they say that if that wasn't their intention? Typecasting can be you meet somebody in a bar, or a coworker says to you, well, you would never be the kind of person that would accept a drink from a stranger, or you're never the kind of person who would ever go out with a coworker. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to force that person into a stereotype so that they can say, oh no, I'd have a drink from a stranger. Oh no, I would go out with a coworker. Loan sharking we see when for you, and then in return you have to give them something. The unsolicited promise, you know, the quid pro quo, you do something for me, I'll do something for you. And the biggest one, you know, no is a complete sentence. If somebody says no, the conversation should be over, yet we often see these manipulators trying over and over again to change somebody's mind. So when we look at behaviors, whether these behaviors are in the workplace or whether these behaviors are in a school setting, one of the first things we might start to see is a social withdrawal. You might have a coworker who maybe not overly friendly, but stops and talks to people, eats lunch in the lunchroom, goes to company functions, but all of a sudden now they distance themselves. And part of it is they may feel isolated due to the situation that's going on in their lives, or they have a paranoia that people keep them away from everyone else. So a sign is if you have somebody, whether it's a student in a classroom or a coworker who suddenly seems withdrawn, that is out of the ordinary for an extended period of time, we're going to want to reach out to that person and say, hey, I've noticed that you haven't been around as much, or not taking part in social activities. Is there anything you'd like to talk to me about, or is there something I can do to help? We never want to just say, you know, is anything wrong? Because the answer is always no. Are you okay? The answer is no, I'm fine. So we want to kind of make it an open-ended question so that they have the opportunity to talk with us. When we look at both rejection and persecution, former FBI agent that I worked with, he often talked about brittle people. And brittle people are people that have what's called an external locus of control. The difference between an internal locus of control and an external locus of control is, for example, if I'm trying to get a promotion at work and they give the job to Bob, and I say, well, the reason that Bob got the job over me is because Bob has more experience. and I have control over my experience. So if I want to get the promotion the next time, I'm going to go out and get more experience. If somebody has an external locus of control, they would say something like, well, the reason that Bob got the job is because Bob is friends with the boss. And I have no control over who the boss is friends with. And so this is why I sometimes feel rejected or persecuted, because I blame everything on everybody else and not take responsibility for myself. When we look at in schools, for example, there are times that if somebody does engage in a target of active violence, it could be striking back out. We often will talk about children who become shooters in schools or stabbings. There was a stabbing today at a school in Canada where a student brought a knife to school and stabbed. Sometimes the victims, in order to gain power, they might bring a weapon to school, a weapon to work, in order to exert their power. If we look at both students or adults, sometimes all of a sudden their work will stop. And, so it might be poor academics or just the quality of work that they're doing. If they're in business, will stop. They won't finish projects on time. They won't complete tasks on time as they need to. When we look at violent expressions, and this is going to be, it's going to be primarily students. Oftentimes we see their artwork, or we see their writings, or we look at some of their poetry that's a violent expression. We will sometimes see this in adults. If there has been a recent workplace violence in which somewhere in the country somebody is killed, and you have a coworker who says something like, well, wow, if that happened here at our company, this would be a better place to work. That's kind of a violent expression, and that should be a red flag that we need to talk to someone. Uncontrolled anger, we tend to see more in younger people. However, we also know that people that are under a lot of stress oftentimes have trouble controlling their emotion, and especially their anger. We look at people's intolerance and their prejudice, if they are against a certain group, whether it be all the managers are out to get me, or this company gives too much preference to women, etc. That's a flag of concern. When we talk about impulsive and chronic hitting, this doesn't necessarily mean to be a punch or a slap. It could be a push. It could be a poking somebody in the chest with a finger. As someone is walking down the hallway at work or at school, intentionally, but trying to make it look like an accident that we bumped into somebody, a way to where anger, our emotions are out of control, and what we want to do is we really want to strike out and hurt someone. It's funny when we talk about bullying is, almost every time I do a talk somewhere about workplace violence and we get into bullying behavior, usually about 25 to 30% of all the participants, when I ask who in here was bullied in school, raise their hand, and then I ask, well, what happens to the bullies? And statistically, 25% of all school bullies eventually end up being incarcerated. Where are the rest of those bullies? They're in the workplace. And, we think that bullying only happens in school, but if you look around your own workplace, you will see that there are bullies. Whether that bullying is a sexual harassment, intimidation, racism, etc., that's a type of bullying. So whether you have students or adults, if they are constantly violating policies and procedures, that's going to be a warning sign as well, because what they're saying is, your rules don't apply to me. So we can talk about aggression. Some people will kick things, throw things, break things at work. And the other warning sign, and we talk about alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. Tobacco, not as much, but if you have employees, if you have coworkers, if you have students who are using alcohol and drugs during the workday, during the school day, this is a definite red flag for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're engaging in behaviors that can put your company at risk due to them being impaired. But we also know that when people are under the influence of many drugs or judgment, and so this could lead to more outbursts of violent behaviors. So I'm sure that most of those listening here today have some kind of drug and alcohol policies, and it's always a good idea that at regular during staff meetings or in your company newsletters highlight those policies, so that not only will the people who are using the drugs understand that they're violating policies, but it lets the other coworkers know that if I believe my coworker is under the influence, I know what action to take with my supervisor. In the affiliation with gangs, it's more of a K-12 situation. Obviously, in gangs today, there's a propensity to violence, there's weapons, etc. And so if students have access to weapons, then and they're on that pathway to violence, they've already accomplished a means of carrying out the violence. Now, some people will say, well, my coworker has a lot of weapons in their house. Does this mean they're on a pathway to violence? And the answer is no. Owning firearms does not make you more likely to use those firearms. However, if you have somebody who is on a pathway to violence due to things that are happening at home, things that are happening at work, things that are just happening in their life with their health, and you're seeing some of these warning signs, and they have access to weapons. And so what we're doing is we're not saying that there's one thing that says, okay, danger is imminent. What we're doing is we're putting a bunch of behaviors together, and we're looking at the totality of the circumstances to determine if whether or not we do have a concern with this person and their acts. Whenever somebody makes a threat is a crime. In Ohio, we call it menacing, and if it's a serious threat, it's aggravated menacing. So whether it's a student at school that says, I'm going to kill you, or a coworker that says, I'm going to kill you, in both of those cases, even though that may not be a serious substantive threat, it is a threat nonetheless. It is a violation of the law, and it is most likely a violation of your company policy. So when people make statements, when they write things down, when they point their finger in the shape of a gun and they point it at a coworker and says, pow pow, if I had a gun I would kill you, that's a warning sign, and that is not acceptable in the workplace, it's not acceptable at school, and it needs to be addressed immediately. So the thing, when I write all of, or when we talk about all of this, some people say, well, Gary, is this just schools or universities? No, this could be any place. When we look at violence in the workplace, and that's partially what we're talking about, is this could be a coworker. This could be a coworker who is under a severe amount of stress due to marital relations, financial obligations, sick parents, sick children, all of these things that the stress is cumulative, and it's building up on their mind. It could lead them on the pathway to violence. So that's why we look at these, and we've included. We did a threat assessment at schools webinar, and if we had enough interest, you can go and you can watch that video by clicking on the link. But if the other thing is if enough people said, wow, we'd really like to see what threat assessment looks like in the workplace, we could do another webinar just on that. So if a person is on the pathway to violence, if we have concerns about someone's behavior, we want to get them early intervention. We want to take them off the pathway to violence. Some people will say, well, Gary, if we have a coworker and he's on the pathway to violence, isn't it best just to fire him? And the answer is no, because if we fire them, we can't monitor their behaviors. We can't get them the help that they need. So, poll question number 1. David, I'm going to kick it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Gary. So the first question we have is, which of the following includes linguistic characteristics of speech? And you've got 4 options. Please choose what you feel is best. The first is pitch, volume, or pace. Second is articulation, pauses, pronunciation. Third would be quality or modulation. Or 4, which is all of the above. So we'll give you a few moments to make your selection, and then we'll look at the results here in just a few. So take your time and choose what you think is best for which of the following includes linguistic characteristics of speech.
And David, am I supposed to be able to see this or not, or just the attendees can see this?
That's a good
just
question.
Attendees can see it.
Okay.
Just attendees can see it right now.
Okay, let's go ahead and view the results. Okay, 100% for all of the above, for pitch, volume, pace, articulation, pauses, pronunciation, quality, and modulation. And I'll let Gary speak to that.
That is outstanding, because what we really need to do is we need to understand when we talk about linguistics, it's not just what somebody says, but it's also how they say it. It could be sarcasm, it could be rolling of the eyes, it could be so many different things. So when we hear somebody talk, we don't just want to listen to the words. We also want to look at, how loud are they saying? Is it what's the rate? What's the pitch? Is it high pitched all of a sudden? One of the things that we do when we're questioning somebody, and we're carrying on a normal, non-threatening questions, and then we ask them a question about maybe a behavior that they engaged in or a criminal activity that they did, and all of a sudden we catch them off guard and they become nervous. Their voice actually goes higher, which is a sign that they're lying or they're nervous about the situation. So let's see, go to the next one. So a lot of good information here. If we look at some of the things that we look at, we know that people, for example, when you look at tempo, if you've ever taken a 911 call before or listened to a 911 call or even made one yourself, you found yourself, because of how nervous you were, speaking very quickly, much quicker than normal. Or if a child is excited, they would they speak much quicker. However, sometimes people, when they are very angry, they deliver slowly. So it's one of those things that, if you've watched people long enough, if you've talked to people long enough, the paralinguist communication can help you understand what emotion a person is going through at the time. So, I always, before my retirement, I was both a teacher and a police officer at the same time. And I was never a person who yelled or screamed much, but I would, if I raised my voice, it was kind of deep. And when I was at school, people would say, well, you're using your police voice. And yet when I was on the street and I would use that same tone of voice, my coworkers would often say, you're using your teacher voice. But sometimes just being a little bit louder is an indicator. So if you as a supervisor, if I have any educators listening to us, you know very well that and on those rare occasions that you do, that's an indicator to your students that, wow, this person must really be angry. The other thing that we talk about is, what are your gestures that you're doing? If I point a finger and I get real close in your space, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize this person's angry, and therefore I should probably step back and de-escalate. So when we look about violent intentions, people will often say things that will make you have concerns. Like, if you continue to talk like that to me, I'm gonna wipe that smile right off your face. I'm gonna knock that smile off your face. And so we listen to what people are saying beforehand. Now, on the one where we talk about bringing a weapon to school or work, sometimes we see, especially with children, if they want to bring a weapon to school, a firearm, they might try to sneak a knife in first, because if you sneak a knife in and get caught, it might be easy to explain why you would have a knife. I accidentally brought it because I work as a stock clerk at the local grocery store, and I use that to open boxes, and I forgot it was in my book bag, or I forgot it was in my pocket. It's very hard to say, oh, I accidentally brought this gun to school. Now, organizations, if you're a business and you've decided as a business that your company policy is no firearms on the premises, even if you have a CCW or concealed carry permit, etc. If your organization has a policy that says no weapons on company property, and somebody brings in a weapon, this is my opinion, this is from advising companies, that's one of the few zero tolerance rules that we should have. Generally, as a rule, zero tolerance means zero thinking. But if you specifically tell your employees, you shall not bring a weapon onto our property, and they do, to me that's immediate grounds for termination, because they're creating an unsafe environment and they're intentionally violating the rules. So people always want to put a line, see the line in the sand and see what happens if they cross it. Weapons are just not a line that we want to we want to deviate from at all. And you know, we could talk about previous school violence attacks. In one case, we actually saw where the student brought a handgun to school to see what the punishment was, and because his parents were teachers, they kind of swept it under the rug, and shortly thereafter he brought a rifle to school and killed his classmates. So we talked about changes in pitch. When people are angry, nervous, etc., their vocal cords tighten, and in tightening, it's kind of like if you take a rubber band and you stretch it and you start plucking it, it makes a higher sound than if you let it relax, and it makes a lower sound. And so if all of a sudden a person is talking and their pitch becomes higher, then that could be a sign of danger. Repetition is one of the things that, you know, sometimes people will say, you'll say to somebody, sir, I'm going to need you to sit down. And they'll start saying, yes, I'm going to sit down. Yes, sit down. And the reason they're repeating the words over and over is because they are starting to have an adrenaline dump. And when you have that large amount of adrenaline in your body, you know, the adrenaline's for either I'm going to fight or flight. And so if I'm going to fight, my brain isn't thinking, how am I going to speak in a complete sentence? So I'm going to use the same words over and over. And I can tell you as a police officer that when someone once pulled a gun on me, the only two words that I could say over and over again in that situation was, or three words, drop the gun, drop the gun, drop the gun, drop the gun, because I couldn't control my emotions enough to think of, sir, if you don't drop this gun, I'm going to have to shoot you, so please drop the gun, because I don't want to shoot you. All I could come out with were the words are, drop the gun, drop the gun, drop the gun. So this is what we'll sometimes see right before somebody engages in violent behavior, that repetitive use of a word, parroting or echoing others. So we talked about the repetition. You know, there's no formal process if the information is completed. If you tell a person to sit down, they keep saying, sit down, sit down, sit down, because they are experiencing the stress that's going on. Heart rate's going to increase. Pupils are dilated. What's interesting is most people in the fight or flight reaction, their vision improves and their hearing decreases, because in a fight or flight reaction, it's more important that we see than it is that we hear. And this is why when I would interview officers after a shooting situation, and I would say, well, how many shots did you fire? And they would say, I don't know, I didn't hear any. And if any of you have ever been to a range and forgot your firearm, you know how loud it. In that situation, they needed to see, not hear. That's why they couldn't hear the number of shots that they fired. Repetition, forced strained speech, the person is focused on fighting it or running away and therefore has to force the words out of their mouth. So sometimes it's going to be, and it's hard for me to exaggerate this in a webinar and not being face-to-face, but somebody saying, I will not sit down. And it's strained because they are so focused on the fighting or flighting, they can't even make a simple sentence without that strain. We see children mostly the nervous laughter when they are trying to, when they're getting ready to engage in violent behavior. Sometimes it's a way for the body to shed emotions. Other times they're trying to distract the person they're going to attack. So if you have somebody and it's inappropriate laughter, that doesn't always mean that it's going to be an act of violence is on its way. Remember, if it's inappropriate, it's just a warning sign that something is not right at that time. Repetition, someone else to watch out as a person speaks about someone as if they are not present. I saw this happen one time. I'm standing in line. The clerk is trying to explain to the customer why they couldn't give them the refund, and the customer, even though the clerk was right in front of them, just, if this person doesn't do as I ask, I'm going to punch them in the face, as if that person wasn't there. And it was almost, if it hadn't been so frightening, it would have almost been comical, because the clerk said, sir, I'm standing right here. I can hear what you're saying. So watch what they say. If a person, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to shed their emotions and build confidence. So if you hear somebody make that threat, if this person doesn't do what I ask, I'm going to punch them in the face. There's that threat that, even though they're acting as if they're ignoring the person, there's that threat that we must take some action to disengage or to get some help around this. We all use sarcasm too much, but I talk about this often with students or in dealing with coworkers when it's, sir, John, I'm going to need you to sit down so we can talk about your latest performance review. Oh, yeah, I'll sit down. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do right now. I'll sit down. And that sarcasm is they're using it to mask what their true intentions, because what he's really saying is, I'm not going to sit down, and you can't make me sit down. In fact, this situation is going to escalate. So, again, I keep talking about this. These signs are not exclusives to schools or universities. It's your shopping malls, churches, place of worship, everywhere. And one of the things that, I'm not saying walk around as we do as a police officer in code red where everything is a danger sign, but code white is how we talk about sitting around at home when you're watching TV and perfectly safe. But when you're out and about, we talk about being in code yellow, kind of looking around, noticing your surroundings, noticing the people around you, because one of the things that could very easily happen to you is if you're at a mall, is there could be an incident going on in which violence may be getting ready to break out between a customer and a clerk or two employees, and you need to be aware of your surroundings so that if you see that, you can immediately get out of that area. So, poll question number 2.
All right. So, poll question number 2 is, which questions should be asked when verbal or nonverbal indicators of violence are observed? And you can select from, does the person have a violent disposition? Does the person have a valid argument? Or does the person have difficult job duties? Is the person exhibiting many indicators of violence? So again, take your time, select your best answer. We'll view the results and then have Gary analyze those for us. So which questions should be asked when verbal or nonverbal indicators of violence are observed? Okay, let's go ahead and view the results. Okay, 80% selected is the person exhibiting many indicators of violence, and then 10% each were, does the person have a violent disposition, or does the person have difficult task assignments? So a few selections there, Gary.
Okay, so 4 is the correct answer, and I think this is really important. Is, you know, when the Secret Service looked at active shooter events after Columbine, you know, everybody said, well, what should we look for? What's the one thing that we should see? And unfortunately, there is no one thing to see. It's what we in law enforcement review the circumstances. So if we go back to the gun ownership, just because a person owns guns doesn't mean they're on the pathway to violence. Just because somebody has an angry outburst at work doesn't mean they're on the pathway to violence. Just because somebody might socially withdraw doesn't mean they're on the pathway to violence. But if we start putting these things together and we start having this conversation, then yes, it could be that somebody's on the pathway to violence. And what we're going to want to do is help that person. I keep, you know, saying over and over again that, you know, if we have either a student or a coworker that's on a pathway to violence, our goal is not to expel that student. Our goal is not to fire that coworker, because just because we expel a student, just because we fire a coworker who's on a pathway to violence, doesn't mean that that problem has gone away. They're just no longer in our school. They're just no longer in our workplace. And when we think about the shooting that happened with the news personnel last year, where a fired coworker shot and killed people on air during an interview, that person had been fired, but was still a problem. And so I want you to understand that, you know, what we want to do is we want to try to help these people. Now, does that mean we're never going to fire somebody who's on a pathway to violence? No. We may have to fire a coworker who's on the pathway to violence. Might we need to put a student who's on a pathway to violence into an alternative learning environment? Yes. But that shouldn't be our end goal. That should just be if nothing else works. So when we look at people, you know, what are some of their body languages is really what we want to do. We want to be able to tell how people, what to look for, the visible signs to look for. And so body language, important things to look at. What do they do with their hands? What do they do with their head? How do they turn their body to us? What are they doing with their clothing? All of those things are indicators of possible violence. And the one that I look at, and I see myself in that picture sometimes, when I'm stuck on a problem and I'm getting so angry, I grab my head, and it's almost a nonverbal way of saying I'm trying to keep everything inside, and that's why I'm squeezing my head. So now again, this is one sign. Does this mean I'm on a pathway to violence? No, it's an indicator that I'm angry. So when we start putting things together again, it's not one behavior, it's not one thing, it's a totality of the circumstances. So hands on head, you know, sometimes we're trying to block so that people can't see our eyes. Sometimes it's kind of like when you play peekaboo with the small child. In that small child's mind, if I can't see you, you can't see me. So the touching of the head, the covering the eyes, when the hands become together, you're trying to get a hold of your anger. So a clenched fist. This is, you know, when generally people don't walk around with their hands in a fist. They might be slightly closed, but if you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden they start talking slower and they're talking through their teeth instead of opening their mouth, and you look down at their hands and all of a sudden you start to see them opening and closing their hands as if they're making a fist, this means that this person could be getting ready to fight. They might start cracking their knuckles. But just because all of a sudden we're talking, but totality of the circumstances. Again, I'm talking very slowly. My fists are opening and closing. I'm wringing my hands. This is a warning sign. If we put that with, blading of the body, that's also going to have to. We'll talk about that in a second. So this wringing of the hands, like we're trying to dry them off, pointing fingers. Watch the hands. And as a police officer, for us, if you sometimes see these YouTube videos and the police are constantly saying to people, get your hands out of your pocket, show me your hands, it's hands that can hurt us. And so that's why we want to look at people's hands if we are seeing other clues that they are getting angry. Now and these are exaggerated body stance. It's obvious that these people are getting ready to fight. But if you look at most people when they're standing, talking to you, their feet are about shoulder width apart, but they're side by side. And so, because that's how people talk to each other. But if somebody all of a sudden, we call it blading, they're talking to you and they put one foot slightly behind the other, we call that blading. And that's more of a fighting stance, because if we want to fight, we're harder to knock over if one foot is forward and one foot is backwards or behind us. If you look at these two guys, the other thing that we're seeing here is the gentleman on the right is right-handed. You can tell that because his right foot is behind his body. The gentleman on the left is left-handed because his left foot is behind him. So this is what we talk about with their fighting stance. You never want to fight somebody with your feet just directly under you, because somebody can just push you and knock you over. When we look, we don't see this very often with adults, but if I'm ever was on playground duty and I see kids starting to take off their jackets, definitely taking off their shirts, this is an indicator that they're getting ready to fight. They're lightening their load. It's easier to punch without a jacket on than with the jacket off or a jacket on. I always tell the story of coming up on two kids that are getting ready to fight. One was a young, smaller child. The other was a bigger bully. And the young child said to the bigger bully, "I'm not going to fight you with your jacket on, because then I'll get in trouble." And so as the bully removed his jacket, both of his arms were behind his back. And that was when the younger, smaller kid took advantage of where his hands were and gave him kind of a haymaker and ended the fight with one punch. But kids taking off their jackets, adults taking off their jackets, their shirts, etc., this is definitely a warning sign that they're getting ready to fight. Again, these signs are not exclusive to a school or university. We can see this kind of behavior anywhere. So, I always worry about when I'm with my family at the mall and you get a couple of teenagers who are getting ready to square off. So, if we're in the food court and you hear kind of a ruckus and you look up and there's a couple of teenagers or young adults and they're starting to take off their jackets, that's a sign that we want to get out of that area, because violence is going to happen. These children are getting ready to fight. So when in conclusion of this, there's no one sign that says somebody's on the pathway to violence or somebody's going to be violent. We need to look at the totality of circumstances, putting things together. I advise all organizations, whether you're a school district or a business, to make sure that you have threat assessment teams in place so that you can evaluate. Know your students, your employees, and your coworkers. When we talk about workplace violence, we talk about the phases of workplace violence, or the types of workplace violence that OSHA is concerned about. And in type 4, coworkers we talk about, but it could also be if I'm in a negative relationship and I'm getting ready to divorce my spouse, and my spouse may be coming to work and bring violence to work, I needed to let my supervisors know that. Always make sure we protect our students, and above all, folks, protect yourself. You don't have to block a punch. You don't have to take a punch. You have to avoid a punch. And sometimes that means if you're in a situation where you believe violence is going to happen, you don't need to stay there. You need to protect yourself. If you can't disengage that person, you need to make sure you get away from that person. So with that, David, I am going to turn it over to you.
Oh, didn't get my mute button there. Okay, that brings us to the Q&A session. I'm going to review the questions here, and then we'll start asking those for Gary. Be just a moment here as I gather these up. Okay, yeah, it looks like we've had a few questions asked here. So let's go ahead and start here with the first question. Gary, it says, children are often skillful manipulators. Does this mean a child who is a manipulator is on a pathway to violence?
No, and you know, what's funny is it seems like the younger the child, and especially because I'm a grandfather for the first time, the more manipulative children get. Part of it is just their behavior. So just because a child may be trying to manipulate you, that's just that one factor. It's not the totality of the circumstances. We look what's going on in the child's life, in the child's behavior, before we say, okay, this child is trying to manipulate us. I always think of Eddie Haskell, and I'm probably dating myself, on Leave It to Beaver, but he was always very polite to Mrs. Beaver, to the point that even she knew he was trying to manipulate her with kindness. And Eddie Haskell was not on a pathway to violence.
Right, he was a master manipulator, though.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. And I can tell you stories of guys who worked with him when he was in Los Angeles police officer. He was on a motor patrol, but that's.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Okay, a few more questions here. If we see any one warning sign or indicator, does this mean we should launch our threat assessment team?
You know, it depends on what the concern is. You know, again, I'll go back to Gavin de Becker and the Gift of Fear. We are all born afraid. You know, it's why as a child we wouldn't go into a dark room by ourselves. And yet as we get older, we put those fears aside. And one of the, if you read the book by Gavin de Becker, The Gift of Fear, one of the interesting things he talks about is a woman is standing, getting ready to go onto an elevator, and the door opens up, and there's just one person inside. It's a male. She looked at that male, and she immediately felt uncomfortable. And so she said, I'm not getting into this elevator with this guy. And then she actually talked herself out of it, because she said, like, well, what kind of bad thing could happen to me by getting into an elevator by myself with this guy where no one can hear me scream? The important thing the important thing to remember is, if you have a concern and that concern makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, go to a supervisor, go to a coworker and say, this made me feel uncomfortable. Because, you know, I'll go back to the break room, and I'm sitting in that break room, and we're reading the newspaper, and I say, wow, you know, did you see where yesterday at an office just like ours, 7 people were killed by a coworker? If that happened here, this would be a better place to work. And I've only done one thing. But, you know, if that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, you go talk to your supervisor, because the supervisor might also know that, you know, I just got a write-up because I was tardy for the 3rd time. And a coworker might say, well, Gary's in the process of getting a divorce. So if you have a concern, share that concern. And then if there are enough other indicators, that's what's going to launch your threat assessment team. Not just one thing, but multiple things or behaviors.
Okay. Makes sense. Understood. There's a few good questions. I think we'll have time. We've got about 10 minutes here. We'll have time to get to these. So the question is, a child listens to heavy metal music or likes to read or write poetry that is dark. Is this a concern?
You know, that's funny because for a time, people would say, man, my child listens to death metal. That was the term back in the day. Does that mean I should have a concern? And I always joke that, gee, I always listened to Barry Manilow when I was in high school. That didn't make me a better boyfriend. So just the kind of music they listen to, no. A lot of kids go through a dark phase. But I keep saying that totality of the circumstances. They write dark poetry. It has a violent nature to it. That's the time to have that conversation. Can you tell me about your poetry? Can you tell me about the music that you listen to? And then you add that with other clues that or cues that a child may have. That could be an indicator that, you know, something might be going on here. But just because they listen to that kind of music does not mean that they're on that pathway to violence or that pathway to suicide, etc.
Okay. And another is, does bullying mean we need to worry about a violent event in our school?
No, but I will say here's a problem with bullying, whether the bullying is in a school or the workplace. Bullying is the sign of a toxic environment. And if you have a toxic environment, that means that people are going to be disengaged. And if people are disengaged, then that's what's going to lead to a violent behavior. So, you know, I was bullied when I was in school because I was small. I wore glasses, but I didn't shoot anybody. I didn't engage in violent behaviors at work or at school. But it means that, man, I wasn't as happy as I should have been. I didn't care about my schooling as I should have been. So what I always want to make sure that schools look at, what I want to make sure that companies look at is, what is your organizational culture? Is it a positive place to be? I don't know of any place, school or work, where somebody wakes up in the morning and says, hot diggity dog, I get to go to work today, or I get to go to school today. But by the same token, nobody should ever wake up in the morning and thinking, I can't go into work again today unless I use drugs or alcohol because it's such a horrible place to work or it's such a horrible place to go to school.
Okay. We've got one more question, which we do have time for. We've done very well with our time. The question is, why is it so important that we watch the hands of those we are concerned about?
It is the hands that will hurt us. And so, you know, if somebody is concealing a weapon, if somebody is, and a weapon could be anything. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a gun or a knife. I think about your receptionist at your workplace, who is sometimes the buffer between an irate customer and a supervisor. And if at that receptionist's desk there's a cup that has scissors in it, or there's a stapler, whatever, the person who becomes angry can use those things as a weapon. So that's why we look for the wringing of the hands, the clenching of the fists, the blading of the body, to know if this person is going to engage in a violent behavior. So always watch the hands; those will hurt us.
All right, thank you, Gary.
I think we have one more question, and somebody asked this. In my experience, what's the best intervention for a child who brings a weapon to school? And if a child brings a weapon to school, and we could spend too much time talking about child development, but part of the issue is a child's ability for rational thought, because their prefrontal cortex isn't developed fully until you're in your 20s. So what I want to say to you is this: if a child brings a firearm to school, that child is going to need to be suspended for, in Ohio, it's up to 10 days before they have an expulsion hearing. And the reason why you must disengage that child from the school for a period of time is you need to find out what's going on in that child's life at that time that led them to bring a weapon to school. You also must develop a safety plan so that if a child brings a weapon to school, how do we keep the other staff and students safe? And so that's going to take a little bit more work. In a case where we had a student bring a knife to school, and he was a younger child, we required that the parent send the child to a psychologist or a psychiatrist and then waive their HIPAA rights so that we could actually have a conversation with the psychiatrist, psychologist, so we could understand why that child was engaging in that behavior and if that child was still a threat to the school. If that child is still a threat to the school, we can't let that child come back to school until we have an adequate safety plan. So, yes, we're going to have to suspend that child for a period of time. And if we can't guarantee a safety plan, we're going to have to engage in a different type of, we're going to have to engage until we can guarantee the safety of everyone. So there's my question, or a question that was asked. And if there's any more, we have a minute or so. I'm happy to say.
Gary, one more did just pop in. I think we'll try to squeeze it in, and then I'll wrap it up here for us. But do you think that universal mental health screeners should be used in schools and workplaces?
You know, our biggest failure, one of the biggest failures in our country today, is the fact that we're not doing enough in terms of mental health. And I can tell you, as both a teacher and a police officer, when I would recommend counseling for a parent and child, the parent would often say, we're trying to do that, but unfortunately we can't get in for 6 months. I know in Franklin County, Ohio, where I live right now, they are putting funding into that. But, you know, when you think about it, you know, if an 8th grader brings a knife to school and displays that weapon in an aggressive manner, that child needs help, and we need to get that child help. And that's where mental health, working with your children's hospitals or some of your faith-based organizations, we need to get these children and adults screened to find out why they are on the pathway to violence and how we can get them off that pathway to violence.
Okay, thank you, Gary. I think I'll wrap it up there. For the attendees, please complete the quick survey at the end of this webinar. And on the survey, you can request a completion certificate for this webinar, and we'll email out the items promised as far as answers to questions, the links and references that Gary provided for us, as well as the presentation. The recording will be posted on our website at lensec.com. And again, you'll see the previously recorded webinars there as well, covering a variety of topics related to physical security. And then lastly, I'd like to take one last opportunity here to thank Mr. Sigrist of Safeguard Risk Solutions for taking the time to talk with us and meet with us today. Again, I'm David with the LENSEC. If either Gary or I can assist you in any way, you should see our contact information posted there. Please feel free to reach out to us via the phone numbers or the email address there, and we'll help you out as best we can. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and look for the next webinar next month, and we'll see you then. Thank you.